Okay, so obviously what we have here is the Kastking Kestrel Elite Bait Finesse reel, and a couple of things about this reel. Number one, this is the most expensive Kastking reel ever made so far, and number two, this could potentially be the most high-spec advanced bait finesse reel ever made, at least on paper, because it is boasting some insane specifications. And of course, in this video we're going to see if the reel actually meets those specs. But let's go ahead and open this box up. Okay, you see some Chinese there, and boom, check that out. And underneath looks like we get some paperwork, and yeah, so we're going to put this off to the side, and let's check out this Kestrel BFS reel up close and personal. Take a look at the shape. Yep, there's that brake dial. This thing this thing is ridiculously light, guys. It is so light it almost feels hollow. Okay, thumb bar so far nice and solid. I can't seem to turn this drag star. I guess it was tightened all the way. Check that out. Check out these knobs. Good looking reel. Good looking reel. It's a little darker than I thought it would be versus the, I guess, CGI pictures they had on their website. But yeah, let me inspect this reel. I have a feeling that I'm going to be taking down a bunch of notes because there's a lot going on. And just give me a few minutes and I will be right back. Now, before we get into all the cool little design details and features of the Kestrel, let's just briefly go over the specs real quick. And of course, we're going to use the box. Alright, so it says 4.5 ounce super lightweight Digicut magnesium alloy frame. Now on the website I could have swore it said 4.4 ounces. So we're going to check that out on the scale. Now it comes with 11+1 ball bearings, and if I'm not mistaken that makes this reel have more ball bearings than any other bait finesse reels except for two. And those are the DAIWA STEEZ Air and the GACKAL Air. 7075 aerospace aluminum gears and main shaft, obviously to save weight. Palm perfect design to keep the reel frame at only 36.5 millimeters tall. And we're going to get more into that here in a moment. Magnesium alloy frame and carbon fiber side plates. 13.2 pounds ultra smooth carbon fiber drag. A little high for bait finesse, but as long as it's smooth and the startup is easy, I have no problem with that. Alright, here's some more on the other side. Comes in only an 8.4:1 gear ratio, both right and left hand. There's the bearing count again, drag numbers again. Here's your mono line capacity, which looks to be pretty standard. It's going to hold about 50 yards of 8-pound mono. There's your braid capacity. Weight again, and there's your inches per turn at 29.1. Now let's get into the design and features of this Kestrel Elite, and let's take a look at the shape. It is very, very aggressive, wide in the back and tapers off to a sharp front. Looks very much like either an arrowhead or the head of a pit viper. And this reel has a lot of angles and edges. Like, look at the top part of the frame. You got these little, I guess, little cutouts. Hopefully you guys can see. Now the front of the reel is the tallest part of the frame, but these little angled cutouts, I guess if you hold it like this, help to make it feel shorter than it is. Now the side plate on the palm side, a lot of angles there, whole lot of angles. On the gearbox side as well. So this is a very angular reel with a lot of design detail. Now one thing I want to say is that the pictures on Kastkings website are a little bit off. Those pictures kind of give it a bluish tint, but this reel is actually a very dark gray, almost as dark as the Darkwolf Ultra. So it's much darker than even the 2016 Shimano ALDEBARAN. Now I personally think they should have went with, I guess, a lighter color to give this reel, I guess, more distinction, because there are quite a lot of dark bait finesse reels out there. But this reel is built very, very well. There are no noises or creaks or clicks or clacks when I turn the handle. But I will say this, the reel is so light that it feels almost like it's all carbon. Now I know it's not. I can kind of feel that the frame is colder than the side plates, but since this is magnesium, it warms up pretty quick, and this feels like it's made of all carbon even though the frame is magnesium. Now once again, the build quality is solid. Thumb bar is very crisp and solid. No mush when engaged or disengaged. The knobs have no in and out play, and I'm assuming there's 2 bearings per knob. There's no in and out play, and the shape of these knobs is very distinct. Now they're very small and very finessey, but you can see they have these angled ridges that seem to, I guess, go the same way, but they are rubber coated and they're very, very soft. Not quite as soft as, you know, Shimano Septon, but almost on par with the current DAIWA knobs that have the plastic with the rubber coating over it. But I guess these ridges add grip. Now one thing I wish they would have done was given this reel better knob end caps, but oh well, that's not that big of a deal. They could have colored them like gold or put gold around the edges, but no big deal. Now this reel is featuring a cone-shaped line guide that's wider at the back and tapers off to a narrow front to decrease that friction angle. Looks like it's poked out pretty good, but looks like they had a millimeter or two they could have went out further, but oh well, that's not that big of a deal. Now the thumb bar is super comfortable. I don't know if you guys can tell, but there's a rubber piece here for grip that's very soft. It's got the Kastking logo, but the shape of it, the little, I guess, groove they put into it, your thumb fits perfectly and it lands right on top of the spool. And it's very high, which is very Shimano-like, which I like. Once you go to a high Shimano thumb bar, it's hard to go back to reels that have lower thumb bars. Now this reel has a lube port right here, but it's very distinct in the fact that they left it that raw silver color, kind of high-end looking versus, I guess, the normal black you find on other OEM reels. Now speaking of which, this reel is very smooth. Now it's not, you know, the Shimano smoothness or even the DAIWA smoothness, but it's got that generic, I guess, Korean OEM smoothness to it. Now let's take a look at this carbon fiber handle. Now it's swept and it's 80 millimeters, so very finesse, but it's got very thin arms, very much like the DAIWA STEEZ Air in its shape, and especially in the way that they retain the nut. You got this little gold piece that keeps the nut from unscrewing, very DAIWA STEEZ like. And one thing I want to say is that on the website I guess the knob rivets looked a lot better, and I guess they went with this design instead, which kind of disappointing, but I'm not really too worried about it. But back to the carbon fiber handle. Hopefully you guys can tell, but it's got a very thick gloss coating. Now there's some people out there that prefer, I guess, a more raw finish, which is more JDM like, but that allows you to see the individual carbon fiber layers, and the gloss coating kind of takes away from that, but I'm indifferent either way. Now this drag star is swept very Shimano like, a lot of detail in it, there's cutouts, but I think it's made of either graphite plastic or maybe it's made of carbon, but it's pretty big. You can actually reach over and use your finger and turn the handle if you want to just crawl a bait along the bottom, but the clicks are very muted. Very muted, doesn't feel that positive, and there's not a big range. So here it is loose all the way, and then there, it's pretty much almost tightened all the way. So not a whole lot of range, but I'm sure it'll perform just fine. Now check out this spool tension. Super good looking spool tension knob. A lot of detail there. Black with the gold rings, the Kastking logo, a little notch there. Now it's a little bit small, but it has got some very precise, positive clicks. So there's not a lot of space or slop in between clicks versus, let's say, like an Abu Garcia. So I really like that. Good looking design. And check out the aluminum trim piece that covers the gearbox. It's black with a couple of gold bands and white writing for contrast. I really like that. Now it says, what does it say? Engineered for competition. Engineered for the win. Alright, well, there are a lot of decals and writing on this reel, but nothing too overwhelming or nothing too gaudy. Now one thing I want to bring attention to is that this Kestrel Elite has probably the best looking brake dial in history. Look at that thing. Very cutting edge design. It's black and this is aluminum, this is not plastic. Now your finger and thumb fit right into these two big cutouts, and then you have two smaller cutouts, and then that white arrow. So the white arrow points to the smaller cutout, and the number fits right into that little cutout window. And the numbers are nice and bright. You can easily see them against the black, which is something you really can't say about Shimano's brake dials, and that's a shame. But turning the dial, it's really positive. The clicks are very close together, not a lot of slop or mush in between clicks, and the brake dial doesn't move. So that is a quality, beautiful design, and it's definitely the best looking brake dial out of any reel that I've ever seen. Now, as far as settings go, I believe there's a total of 23. So plenty of settings for fine tuning. Alright, so let's go over the last feature, and I think you guys know where I'm going, and that is the clicking drag. Alright, so this clicking drag is very quiet compared to the clicking drags of other reels, which I like. Very muted, but it's very quality. I guess it feels a lot better than the clicking drags of other reels. Let's say versus the Xenon LTX that I have. So if you like loud, juddering clicking drags, The Kestrel does not have that, which is a plus in my book. So I brought out the usual suspects for the size comparisons, but before we get into that, I just want to say that I mounted the Kestrel on 4 different rods, 2 of them having the Fuji ACS reel seat, one of them had the Fuji PTS reel seat, and one of them was a Shimano rod, so it had the Perfection reel seat. And this reel is extremely comfortable, sits very, very low, but I felt that it matched up the best feel-wise with the rods that had the Fuji ACS reel seat. But it was extremely comfortable with all of them. So let's get to these size comparisons. Now the first reel we're going to compare it with is going to be Kastking's own Zephyr, which is the original Kastking bait finesse reel. And you may not be able to see it through the camera, but it is noticeably smaller than the Zephyr. No big surprise there. Of course, we got to switch up places. But yeah, both of them are about the same width, but the Zephyr is noticeably longer, and more importantly, the Zephyr is way taller, much taller than the Kestrel Elite. Now next up is going to be a cheaper Chinese market reel, and that's going to be your Dark Wolf Ultra. And right here you can really see the similarity in color, but it looks to me that the Dark Wolf Ultra, I don't know, they're very close. It's just that there are so many angles and lines on the Kestrel, while the Dark Wolf Ultra is relatively smooth, that it's hard to tell. It looks like the Kestrel may be a tad bit wider and a little bit shorter, but height wise they are very similar. It's hard to tell which one is lower. Right, next up is going to be the old Shimano ALDEBARAN 2016 model, and from this angle the ALDEBARAN looks noticeably bigger. Both of these reels have very pointy noses, but even when I switch up sides, the ALDEBARAN does look bigger, and it definitely palms bigger as well. But you can definitely see the color of the Kestrel is definitely darker than the old ALDEBARAN BFS. Alright, now next up it's going to be the Kestrel versus DAIWA's Alpha's Air. So this comparison will be valid versus the Gekabidgen as well as the Silver Creek reel. And it looks to me like the DAIWA is smaller. It's a little bit narrower. Yeah, you can definitely tell it's narrower. And maybe they're about the same length. But the DAIWA looks deceptive because the top of the frame is positioned way back here instead of popped out like a lot of other reels. But when you compare the height, the Kestrel does look slightly lower, even though both of these reels have very small 28mm spools. Alright, so next up is going to be the Kestrel against the 2022 ALDEBARAN BFS. You can definitely see the color difference. Now I have the exposure compensation on my camera turned up to make the picture brighter, so you can see all the details, but they look very similar in size. Well, right there the ALDEBARAN looks a little bit bigger, but I think the Kestrel palm's smaller. And then right there you can definitely see they're very close in height, but exquisite brake dial, ugly brake dial. So hopefully Shimano will take note in the future for their future bait finesse reels. Take some hints from Kastking. But yeah, the ALDEBARAN looks massive compared to the Kestrel from this angle. Okay, so the last comparison is going to be with a reel that could potentially be considered competition price-wise for the Kestrel, and that's going to be your CURADO BFS. So the CURADO actually looks bigger, at least from this angle. They look about the same width. And now the CURADO looks smaller. So this is why I changed places. And it looks like the Kestrel is a little bit lower than the CURADO. Probably by a couple of millimeters. Wow. So this is a very, very low profile reel. Alright, so now it's time to get to the important stuff, especially for bait finesse reels. And we're gonna get a weight on the reel as well as this spool, as well as check out those brakes. Okay, so the scale's out and it's time to see if Kastking met their target of making the lightest reel in the world. And we're also going to see whether the website weight is correct or the box weight is correct. Now we're not going to beat around the bush, and let's switch this up to ounces. Here we go. And here we go. Whoa. 4.49 ounces. So it's almost 4.5 ounces, but the fact that it says 4.49 means that Kastking has indeed met their mark of making a reel that weighs 4.4 ounces, even though it's on the high side of 4.4. So kudos to Kastking. And like I said earlier, this reel feels almost hollow, it's so light. But by comparison, I think the next lightest bait finesse reel in production today is the SHIMANO ALDEBARAN. It's coming in at 4.69, so you're looking at 0.2 of a gram lighter for the Kastking Kestrel. And I think the next lightest reel is probably going to be the DAIWA STEEZ Air. But the one thing that these three reels have in common is that magnesium frame. Everything else has either a carbon composite frame or an aluminum frame. So the three lightest BFS reels in the world all have magnesium frames. So now it's time to get to the nitty-gritty, and we're gonna get a weight on this spool and check out these brakes. Alright, so I guess you just unlock it like that and it pops straight out. And check out these brakes, guys. Look at that. You can definitely see that they're using, it looks to be square magnets instead of round. Very Shimano FTB like, but we're gonna get to this in a second. Let's check out this spool. And it appears that the tolerances are extremely tight because I'm having a hard time pulling this out. Now don't tell me that the spool pin is stuck. I might have to pull this out off camera. I'll be right back. Alright, so I was finally able to get the spool out, and I went ahead and took out some spools of some competing bait finesse reels. But let's take a look at the spool of the Kestrel Elite. Now it's called the Feather Spool. You can see it's sporting a short spool shaft that's made of aluminum. It's got a bearing that's pretty small. It's definitely not a standard bearing. It might be what I would consider as micro, but the center's ported pretty good. But this spool is a tiny 28 millimeters, so it pretty much matches all the current DAIWA bait finesse reels, and it's supposed to weigh only 5.6 grams, including this bearing, which is incredible. So this might be potentially the first stock BFS spool that comes in at under 5 grams in weight, but we're going to check that later. But now I'm going to compare the size of this spool to its competition, and here's the DAIWA Alpha's Air spool. They are virtually identical in dimensions, pretty much the same width, same depth. It looks like maybe the DAIWA is a little bit deeper, but yeah, they were definitely emulating DAIWA when it came to this feather spool for the Kestrel Elite. So next up is the spool of the 22 ALDEBARAN BFS. They look very similar in the fact that they're black and have very minimal porting only in the center. But you can definitely see that the ALDEBARAN BFS has a wider diameter spool than the Kestrel. And this is supposed to be 29 millimeters. But I've seen a Japanese fishing blogger measure it, and it's actually 29.5. So it's probably closer to 30 millimeters than 29. But there's a definite size difference there. Now here's the spool of the Dark Wolf Ultra, currently the lightest stock BFS spool in the world. It's supposed to have a 30 millimeter spool, and you can definitely see the difference there. About the same width. Now here's the spool of the Xenon LTZ, which was very disappointing, also 30 millimeters. But very heavy compared to this competition. But I just wanted to bring it out due to the fact that the Xenon LTZ is a new current BFS reel. And then the last spool we're going to compare it with, it's going to be your CURADO BFS, which has a mammoth, at least in this company, 32 millimeter spool. And yeah, it's a little bit wider as well. I'm going to do one thing here. I think the width on the Kestrel spool is actually a little bit wider than the ALDEBARAN BFS, just a little bit. Alright, so enough of the comparisons. Let's see if Kastking hit their target weight of 5.6 grams with this bearing. Oh shit, it's actually 5.42, so actually lighter than the specification on the website. Wow. Once again, 5.42 grams with the bearing. So let's weigh these other spools real quick. DAIWA Alpha's Air with the bearing, 8 grams. 22 ALDEBARAN BFS with the bearing, 6.5 grams. Dark Wolf Ultra with the bearing, 6.17 grams. And these bearings look pretty much like they're the same bearing. Okay, here's the Xenon LTZ, whopping 12.8, or I should say 12.08 grams. Now I'm going to be uploading the follow-up casting video to the LTZ here in a few days. But here's the spool of the CURADO BFS, 8.86. No bearing for the CURADO. So this reel just absolutely takes a crap on all these other reels when it comes to spool weight. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take this bearing off and see what the true rotational mass is. Alright, so I removed all the other spools except for 2, because to be honest, this is really only a 2 spool fight. And of course we got the spool of the Kestrel Elite, and then we have the spool of the reigning spool weight champion reel, the Dark Wolf Ultra. Now the bearings are removed. If I'm not mistaken, this should weigh 5.3 grams, which it does right on the nose, which is incredible, especially given the price of the reel. But let's see what the Kastking Kestrel Elite spool weighs. Damn! 4.56 grams. Are you kidding me? 4.564 grams. This is insane, guys. I thought it was going to be something like, 4.9, but we're looking at a 4.5 gram stock spool. And this spool does not feel like it's flimsy or fragile. I'm pressing on it, the metal feels thick. So this is insane. 4.5 grams for a stock spool. And just to think, only about 2 or 3 years ago, I was being amazed by a 4.8 gram aftermarket spool that costed like $110 for my ALDEBARAN BFS. So Kastking has moved the game on significantly because this spool is much lighter than even the Dark Wolf Ultra. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a graphic up on the screen for you guys and just show you the hierarchy of spool weights of all the bait finesse reels that I have. And nothing comes close to the feather spool of this Kestrel Elite. Kastking was definitely not playing. So now that we've seen that the Kestrel Elite's feather spool literally just took a dump on all the other current bait finesse reels, it's time to go over something that's just as important as a spool, and that of course is going to be the brakes. Because having the lightest spool in the world doesn't matter if your brakes are crap. Alright, so let's take a closer look at this brake system. And for comparison's sake, I brought out the brakes of the current 2022 Shimano ALDEBARAN BFS. Now they're very similar. And one thing you can see is that while Shimano is using these round silver magnets, which are plainly visible, Kastking is using these black square magnets. And let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So a total of 5 magnets. And on the other side as well. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I think they call this the fly out arc brake system, which, let's be honest, this is a copy of Shimano's dynamic FTB system, and I guess if they were going to copy a brake system, that's going to be the best system to copy. But let me show you what I found out about this fly out arc brake system. But now it's time to see if this is also a dynamic system, and we're going to see if one side of each bank of magnets is going to move. Oh yeah, there we go. And that's a lot of movement as well. That's a lot of travel. Okay, so that's one side. Okay, and here's the other side. And what about the... Nope, the other side does not move. Alright, so just like Shimano's FTB, one side of each bank of magnets will move closer to the spool during the hardest part of the cast and eventually retract down during the latter half of the cast to theoretically give you more cast distance. But if you watched my preview video on Kastkings' website, we saw that there were 3 springs located in this hub, which I theorized might be another point of movement to allow Kastking to use this style of brake system and not infringe on, I guess, Shimano's FTB patent. But look at that, it does not move at all. I'm squeezing, there's no kind of compression in or out. So I guess those springs were for a different purpose and not giving this a second form of dynamic movement during the cast. So it's very interesting to see that they just straight up copied Shimano's FTB, just changed a couple of things, and maybe they're, paying some kind of license fee to Shimano. But let me show you guys something. The spring location on the bank of magnets is going to be different in the Kastking, so maybe that is just enough to avoid any kind of patent issues. So the spring is right there, and then the other spring is right there, but this is not part of the magnet bank that moves, it's the other side. See right there? So with Shimano, I think it's different. I think the spring is probably located right under the side of the bank of magnets that does move. So the spring for the Shimano FTB is probably here, while the spring on Kastkings Flyout Arc brake system is on the opposite end. So tricky move there by Kastking, and maybe that's just enough of a difference to avoid any kind of patent infringement. But here are the brakes. I think, what is it? Yeah, this is the maximum position. And now we're gonna turn them down to the minimum position, and they just barely moved a millimeter or two. So very unlike Shimano's current FTB, where you can literally recess the magnets all the way into the brake hub. So the only question is, are these magnets actually strong enough? Or are they going to be like the Dark Wolf Ultra and be too weak? And I guess the only way to find out is going to be spooling the reel up and taking it out fishing. Okay, so obviously I am very impressed with the insane numbers that the Kestrel Elite has shown us, and it looks like Kastking has moved the bar so far forward that companies like Shimano, DAIWA, Abu Garcia are probably thinking to themselves, Kastking, what the hell are you doing? And what I mean by that is that, of course, Shimano, DAIWA, Abu Garcia could have came out with a reel with the same numbers as the Kestrel Elite. But those companies are playing the long game, and what I mean by that is that they improve their reels in small incremental steps. They're not going to give you all their best all in one package, because it would be literally impossible, or very hard at least, to improve on that reel with the next generation. So it's going to be interesting to see how other companies are going to respond with their future bait finesse reels. Are they going to try to match or outdo the Kestrel in spool weight, maybe spool size, or maybe we'll see some kind of new revolutionary braking system? But either way, us bait finesse enthusiasts are going to win. Now I'm going to close this video out with, I guess, the one controversial aspect about the Kestrel Elite, and that is going to be its price. Now once again, the price is $219, and for that price, the closest direct competition is probably going to be your Shimano CURADO BFS, coming in at $200, and of course you're going to have to add on sales tax. And then the next reel up is going to be your DAIWA Alphas Air, which I think is around what, $260 or $270 right now. But the Kestrel Elite really craps on those reels as far as BFS specifications go. And in fact, the Kestrel Elite, when it comes to on-paper specs, there's only two reels that can compete with it, and that's going to be your Shimano ALDEBARAN BFS, which comes in at, I think, what, $280 to $300 right now, and then your DAIWA STEEZ Air, which I think is around $450. So when you look at it like that, this reel is the biggest bait finesse bargain of all time, at least in my opinion, and I don't see a problem with the $220 price point. But let's be honest, if this reel had another brand slapped on its side, and I'm not talking even, you know, Shimano, DAIWA, or Abu Garcia, let's say it said LEWS or Quantum right here, or even Okuma, nobody would have a problem with this reel costing $220. But since it's a Kastking, there's going to be shills and fanboys in the comment section of any bit of social media on this reel trying to talk it down. But for all you non-fanboys and non-shills out there, let me put it to you like this. Now with this Kestrel, I think I have a total of 5 Kastkings now. I have the Assassin, I have the Royal Legend Elite, both of which were sent to me by a generous subscriber. I have the Speed Demon Elite, the Zephyr, and now the Kestrel. And from the Royal Legend Elite on, these reels feel like mainstream offerings. They are totally different than the first Kastkings that popped up on the scene. I think the Assassin was one, maybe the Stealth was another, I can't remember all of them. But the ones that costed like $30 or $40 and you saw them on social media all over the place a few years ago. These new Kastkings are definitely in a whole nother league of build quality, and that's all I'm going to say about that. So ultimately it's going to be up to you whether you think this new Kestrel Elite is worth it or not. So of course the next step is to see if all these impressive on-paper specs are going to equal out to an equally impressive casting and fishing experience. And on my next available day off, I'm gonna string it up and I'm gonna try to go trout fishing and see what's what. And of course, I'm gonna share that experience with you guys. All right, guys, thanks a lot.